Africa has for many years contributed significantly to various global peace initiatives, but the continent still holds no permanent seats on the UN Security Council, a structure that has remained unchanged since post-World War II. African leaders historically have proposed reforms for the allocation of at least 2 permanent seats on the UN Security Council.
If you look at permanent membership, it is only the developed countries that are there. And if you look at the evolution that is taking place around the world and development, there are now a justification to bring in more countries so that you make it more representational.
Africa has also raised concerns about what they call the misuse of veto power.
There's no question about the fact that the use of veto has also been challenged. In fact, one of the reforms that is being suggested is to say, let's do away with this veto because it has been, in most cases, misused and has brought about paralysis at the Peace and Security Council.
Support for the reforms extends beyond African borders. Many international organizations and several non-African countries have acknowledged the validity of Africa's claims, potentially lending momentum to the reform agenda. But the actualization of these changes remains complex. It requires consensus from the 5 permanent Security Council members and a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly. The P5 have all expressed varying degrees of support, making drastic reforms challenging. As countries continue to identify potential challenges and propose solutions for reform, for now, Africa stands united in its call for a seat at the table. Daniel Arab Moi, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Well, for more on that, we're joined by Chris Ogunmudede, a foreign affairs analyst. He joins us via Zoom from Lagos, Nigeria. Thank you so much for joining us, Chris. Chris, Africa continues with this push for permanent seats on the 15-member UN Security Council. How important would it be for the continent?
Fairly significant when you consider the historical as well as contemporary context. Historically, when United Nations was formed, most African nation states were under colonial rule. They aren't anymore, but the existence of the United Nations is very much tied up into the independence and post-independence history of most African countries. Today, they are 28% of the United Nations body, 54 member states. They have been among the most steadfast supporters of the United Nations and the much broader multilateral system. African issues tend to predominate on the Security Council as well as the General Assembly. So African countries do regard themselves as stakeholders in the United Nations and in international multilateral system more broadly. So they do expect and call for much more robust engagement in the United Nations system, including the Security Council, which comes with veto powers, and because they believe it will accelerate their ability to get peace, security, and governance issues at the Security Council further ahead on the agenda, on the international agenda.
So, Chris, looking at this whole situation, what would you say is preventing the Council from approving the permanent seats? Because as you've mentioned, and others have said this too, Africa's membership has been central to the Council's work.
It's purely power politics to, at the risk of simplifying, the 5 members of the permanent members of the UN Security Council have veto powers, they are nuclear powers. They are an exclusive club. They do not want other members, despite the annual sort of paeans to multilateralism and inclusivity and all of these norms. When the pedal hits the metal, they don't want more, veto, more permanent members who wield veto powers. It's just that simple. So it's purely geopolitics in the basic sense of it. But then there's also the reality of strategic competition among the powers themselves. You have on one block you have the Western powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, and then you have Russia and China. All of these 2 blocks aren't always aligned even among themselves, and they aren't always in sort of this rivalry. But broadly speaking, you have that context. You have China and Russia in much more of a rivalry today. Well, there's the argument that the rivalry never really stopped, but certainly in the last 10 years, it's become more pronounced. And that has ground the Security Council to a halt effectively. You see this in other international organizations, like the World Trade Organization, where the appellate system and the rules of trade and commerce have been really difficult to enforce because you have this paralysis between the great powers. So in a sense, it's structural in that the great powers don't want more veto-wielding members, but there's also the intra great power rivalry between the two blocs, as I mentioned.
See, Chris, I mean, this might be a bit of a tricky question because if it was easy, it would have been done by now. But what do you think can be done further in terms of roles that regional and international organizations can Africa play to help them make their voices heard?
Well, I do think that the African countries have made more progress than is commonly acknowledged. You know, so you have, for instance, the Ezowini Consensus from 2005, which is the defining position of 2 permanent seats on the UN Security Council, as well as 5 non-permanent seats. So that hasn't materialized. However, you have had a number of instances where other parts of the UN system, like ECOSOC, UNECA, have been granted more, if not quite powers, but they've been given more privilege to be able to take the lead on a number of key issues that African countries are happy with. You know, when you have African countries get rotations, non-permanent rotations on the UN Security Council, they have been able to table a number of discussions, as seen in the recent years with Ghana, Gabon, Kenya, for instance, who have pushed UN Security Council reform on the international agenda, to the extent that the Biden administration has pledged, you know, nominally at least, to be committed to UN Security Council reform. That may not have affected itself in the UN, but it has trickled down to other international organizations or forums like the G20, for instance, where the African Union was applied to join the group and its application was accepted. So I tend not to see progress as defined in the way people do in sort of a one-dimensional way. I see all of these conversations and groups as existing concurrently, and you know, so there's a constellation of forces that tend to move around the different important multilateral systems. So I do think that it's a long game to play, but African countries have made some progress in terms of the demands they have made of the great powers and the much broader international system at large. And I think there's a lot that it's tricky, of course. Global politics is not easy, but there's certainly a lot that they have accomplished, and there is much more that they can accomplish as long as they can get a consensus around the members, because I think that's really the real obstacle to getting progress in terms of a common position on the Ezowini Consensus, for instance, as well as in other international bodies.